Welcome to the Behind the Connection podcast. This is the podcast that covers all things internet and technology related. The good, the bad, the complexities, and the realities. We talk about it all right here on Behind the Connection. I'm your host, and my name is Tyler Rasmussen. Today's topic is a fun one. Lots of discussion around 5G wireless technology. As consumers, we've been inundated the last 10 years with the evolution of wireless data technology. We've transitioned from 1x data to 3G and 4G or LTE and now LTE advanced, and everybody's hearing about 5G today. So I got a couple of our local experts here in the studio with me today. I've got Alan Bennion and Jeff Cranney, aka Alpha and Omega. It's the way they wanted to be introduced. And when people's phones don't work, they probably want to realize how much power you two have and making sure that their phones are working correctly. So yeah, these are a couple of great guys that have been with Strata for many, many years. I've worked with them and known them for probably close to a couple of decades now, and really pleased to have them here in the studio with us to discuss wireless technology and specifically 5G. Why don't you guys take just a minute and introduce yourself to the listeners? Alan, why don't we start with you? What's your role at Strata, your title, and tell us a little bit about what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Wireless supervisor over acquisition and cell site maintenance. So we have 3 areas of coverage: Utah, Wyoming, Colorado. Around 100 or so cell sites in that geographical area. Day-to-day basis would be checking alarms, weather, seeing what's going on with the network. If we've got outages, power, weather related or anything like that, and dispatching guys to take care of those and maintaining the networks. I work a lot with leases and acquisition, actually getting the cell site, from the landowners, leasing that and getting right-of-ways and different things like that together.
So these sites are all probably like, downtown Vernal and downtown Roosevelt, places that are easy to get to, I assume, right?
No, just the opposite.
I wanted to describe your job as a really cush job, but no, I know Strata's got some sites in some crazy places, top of Blue Mountain, Rainbow out in the Book Cliffs, Buck Canyon. I mean, you name it, all across the basin in some pretty crazy places. And obviously, we'll probably break it down a little bit on the podcast today, but a lot of places that don't have power, and, you got to figure out how to get fuel sources to them and make them function and run. Yeah, a lot goes into it. So what's the size of the team that you work with? How many guys do you have working with you? We have 4
full-time wireless technicians that maintain those 3 state areas. And great guys, and that's what makes the job fun, is good employees and people that care about the network. We have somebody monitoring the network 24/7 every day of the year for outages and being dispatched between the cell techs and the guys that watch the switch. So, and weather's not our friend.
Yeah,
we have some challenges accessing the sites daily. Sometime in the weather is the hardest thing.
Those challenges can also be fun, right? Snowmobiles and snow cats and all sorts of fun stuff, right?
If you're a foul weather friend, yes.
Which I know you are. So anything from, you basically take probably like a predefined location that's going to come from probably Jeff's team. He's going to basically engineer a location where you want to build a site. You're going to have to go out and secure the site from a landowner or property owner, get a lease in place, get access, and then figure out actually how to provide the necessary infrastructure to the site, which would be what? First of all, what's the infrastructure you'd need at a cell site?
Well, you need a tower and a shelter to put your equipment in, power, fiber or copper to that site. We have generator backup on a lot of them. We do have some solar sites, but we get together as teams and figure out where we need more coverage or if population's growing, that type of thing. And then we'll go out and put those on some search rings and look at some areas and see what kind of coverage that we think the mountaintops will give, and then go from there and contact the landowner.
So then, let's see. So your team, you used to have the team that actually constructed the site, right?
Yeah, the tower crew.
You work closely with them anyways, So then basically build the site and then install the equipment on the site and maintain the equipment, right? So that's all to a certain degree in your direct purview, or you have a good influence on it, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. That's a really good summary. Jeff, Mr. Jeff Cranney. What's give us a peek into your day to day and what your title is and what your.
I'm the wireless network supervisor. My day to day starts out with several different hats, depending on which one I want to put on to start the day with. But like you mentioned, I work with Alan and Tim closely on engineering the cell sites, figuring out where the RF needs to go. And
what's RF?
And
I'm going to stop these guys several times because they're going to use acronyms like crazy.
The radio frequency that's output by the site. So
gotcha.
That has to be engineered and looked at closely so that we make sure the site sings like we want it to sing. So I engineer that, work with people who do the drawings and get everything done that way. I may put on a different hat like I did today and be in training all day. And in that training, we're trying to figure out how to best serve our network and our customers, how to move into the future with more tools into our hands, and how to look at the future things. So you mentioned 5G. Well, my team's been working on 5G now for 6 months or longer, watching that runway and how it is. And the 6G isn't out yet, but we're already looking forward to beyond 5G.
Don't even start talking about 6G yet.
What that starts to look like. So
let's just skip to like 10G or something.
Yeah. So my team's kind of a hodgepodge of different departments. I have the roaming department, and I have the handset certifications department, and I have the optimization drive testing department, and then I work closely with Mark Murphy and his group with the core. So
okay,
so lots of different hats, but that's what we get to do as small carriers, and that's what makes our jobs the most fun in the company. I think Alan and I have the funnest jobs in the company.
So you say you use the term small carrier, which I think is interesting. Maybe we can try to scope for the listener the size and relativity of Strata, in comparison to some of the other carriers. We obviously know there's 4 great big carriers, right? AT&T, T-Mo, Sprint, Verizon. And then below that, like, where's the next step down? Like, where would Strata fit in like a national map of carrier size?
Well, they rank carriers by what they call tiers. And so Verizon, AT&T would be a tier 1 carrier. Then they have tier 2s. There's not very many tier 2s. That would be like a U.S. Cellular size. And then tier 3 and tier 4. So Strata is probably in the tier 3 category. And we also operate through our Arena group, tier 4 carrier levels.
Okay,
So
we'll come back and talk
carriers.
about what Arena is. So in my mind, I've always assumed that Strata is probably in like the top 30 for sure in the country of size and scope. Is that a fair?
Yeah, we're probably close to that.
Okay.
Yep.
So it's interesting to think that you've got the top 4 that serve hundreds of millions of customers, right, in the U.S. And then from there, it drops off precipitously. You've got a couple of those intermediate carriers like U.S. Cellular.
Right.
But then there's really nobody, right, other than a bunch of,
Not
even a bunch. There's 30 or 40 or 50 regional carriers like Strata that kind of fill in all the holes, correct?
Yep.
And that's critical not only for Strata customers, but for those big 4 carriers,
Right.
correct? Because those companies are working with, the big 4 are working with companies just like Strata to fulfill their nationwide coverage claims, correct?
Right. Yep.
Without the stratas, the regional stratas that exist throughout the U.S., they can't make that commitment and that promise, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
So you mentioned kind of 4 groups. I just want to make sure the listener kind of understands. You mentioned the drive testing or optimization group. So that's a crew that basically drives around and tests coverage, right? And and then reports back the data and says things seem to be working well here, but not working well here. And then you'll optimize the sites and tuning and pointing to where things are working as well as they possibly can.
Yep.
Correct?
So that department does cell site turnups. Along with Alan's group. They work closely in making sure a new site fits into the network like it's supposed to. And then if we get complaints or issues where, there's a network issue somewhere, they will go out and target that specific area. And just generally they're driving around looking for issues, hopefully before they become problems. We try to eliminate those before they ever become a noticeable problem in the network.
So you definitely want people to report if they're finding dead spots.
Yes.
Many of those you probably already know.
Yep.
After all, it is the Rocky Mountains, and in spite of the fact that we have, like Alan said, 100 cell sites that we maintain, there are some places where the coverage just doesn't exist, right? You're going to drop a call.
Almost definitely, yep.
But definitely if a consumer sees a new location where they're dropping calls or sees a change in their coverage, we would absolutely want them to report that fairly quickly,
Yes.
right? Because that could be an issue with the network that your team could jump on and
Yep.
correct.
Yep.
Okay, so that's what that department does. You mentioned the roaming department, and that crew is probably mostly responsible for, based on what you said, I'm assuming they work with other carriers
Yep.
to put in place agreements where our customers can use their networks when they're out of the Uinta Basin, and vice versa. The
Right.
other carriers' customers can use STRATA's network when they're in the Uinta
Yep.
Basin. Is
So
that correct?
roaming's been important from the beginning, from the analog days through the CDMA days, through the 3G days, and 4G, and now into 5G. We've had to update, work with carriers that have similar technology to us, and work out agreements so that they can use our network and we can use their network seamlessly. So that's what that group does. They negotiate deals. They work out contracts. They work out how the technology is going to work between the carriers and what happens and what doesn't.
So I'm going to ask a really tough question, and probably one that aggravates us a little bit as Strata employees. But I hear oftentimes, or not oftentimes, I hear at times that a consumer will attempt to blame Strata because a certain carrier doesn't have coverage here in the basin, or that their coverage has changed. What would you say to that? Are there times when Strata puts up a barrier and just says to a company, no, we're not going to work with you and you can't roam on our network, period?
Well, that wouldn't do us any good, because we want the revenue from any carrier that'll give it to us, and so we work closely with them to try to make sure their customers have as good of experience as our customers, and keep that traffic flowing, because the roaming piece of our network is good revenue to us, and we don't purposely block anybody unless they were coming in causing problems to our network, and we've never really ran into that.
So is this a safe statement too? And I know that there's confidentiality agreements that bind us from, specifically you, from stating like specific carriers that we have roaming agreements with, but is it a safe statement to say that Strata has roaming agreements with some of the biggest carriers as well as small regional and localized players, right? We work with all of them.
Yeah,
right?
we have a lot of agreements.
Yeah. Maybe not hundreds, but dozens, right?
Yeah. Well,
several dozens.
Back in the analog world, I would say it was probably in the hundreds, but as carriers have consolidated and been bought out and things like that, they're probably into the 30 to 40 range now.
Okay. Let's see, really quickly then, you mentioned we covered optimization, drive testing, and we covered roaming. You mentioned handsets. That's the crew that tests new handsets before we put them on the network. And some consumers might be surprised to think that you actually have to test a handset before it goes on the network, but we don't want to put a device on our network that's going to create an issue for the consumer, right?
Right.
And so we test them all before we authorize them, before we even sell them. And there have been times where we've tested devices and we just choose to not even offer them, correct?
That department's the funnest one to be in.
Because
you get all the latest, greatest things. You got to try to make it work. It's you get kind of the cutting edge technology right there in that group. But just because it's a Android phone doesn't mean it's an Android phone that will work on Strata. I mean, there's hundreds of parameters in phones that have to be taken care of and set before they work on a carrier. And the same thing would be with the other OEM phones.
Gotcha. So a lot's going on, a lot going on between the groups that you two manage and work with, and you're both serving, and your people are both serving a very critical role for Strata and its consumers. So when and why did Strata get into the wireless business? Been a while, but who wants to take a stab at that one? Don't fight over it, you two.
I think it was the late 80s, early 90s.
Prior to all of our time, right?
Yeah.
You've been here nearly 20 years, both of you?
21.
Yep, I've been just a little bit less than Alan.
So more than 2 decades ago. Okay.
Yeah, I think it was the IMTS system, and then in the early 90s went to the analog system.
Gotcha. So why do you think Strata chose to get involved?
I don't think anybody else would. I think we covered the whole basin with 3 cell sites, Blacktail Ridge.
And this was, like you said, prior to anybody else
Yeah.
offering any sort of cellular service at the time, correct? And Strata as a cooperative has kind of had that be their mantra. That's been their purpose and their mission for many, many years, is delivering services to consumers that couldn't get it any other way. And so I think at the time, from what I've read in the historical context, is that they chose to offer the service because, once again, the big cellular carriers weren't coming to rural Uinta Basin to offer that service, so Strata chose to do it on its own.
Yeah.
Correct? Okay. So we've talked quite a bit about some of the components of being in the wireless business, cellular business, but what are some components maybe we've missed? We've talked a lot about handsets. That's the one that consumers use every day and they're most familiar with. And I think consumers see cell sites and they understand that that's necessary for their phone to function and work. But what are some of the pieces that are maybe behind the scenes that they really don't have any idea about, that you guys either have to manage or that they can be a challenge for a wireless carrier? What are some other things?
Particularly for me, would be loading on the tower. If we could have 20 or 30 years ago, if we could have, seen what was going to be on the towers then we would have done things differently, because of the amount of equipment that's on a tower. You can only put so much up there before it's overloaded, and then it becomes a safety issue.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Jeff, how about from your perspective?
Well, the towers that you see are very, they're not a small part, but they're kind of a small part of the network fabric that's behind them. We have microwave systems, we have fiber systems, we have a whole core, and a core is what does all the switching and making sure your traffic gets to where it needs to be, whether it's data traffic or voice traffic or whatever traffic there may be. That switch network is as robust or bigger than the cell site network itself.
So can you maybe, once again, for my benefit and the listeners' benefit, can you break down just really at a really high level, when I make a call from a wireless phone, it's obviously using a wireless signal to go to a cell site, right? Yeah. Where does that call or that data session, that internet session, where does it, go from there?
Once it goes from your phone to the cell site, then the wireless piece is done, unless you go through a microwave system. But at that point, it hits the terrestrial type network and then goes back to the core, and the core does all kinds of different things, and it has to look up, like, we're almost like a street address. Where does this call belong? Where do I need to send it to Google? Do I need to send it to Skype? Do I need to send it to Salt Lake and 801, a 435 number, or whatever? There's hundreds and thousands of decisions that need to be made in the core in order to route that traffic.
So backing up just a little piece, you use the term the terrestrial network, which may not be familiar to some of our listeners. So once it hits that cell site, you're telling me that every cell site, unless it has a microwave signal, it's connected with copper or fiber.
Yep, somewhere in the system, even if it's microwave, is going to hit a fiber. We prefer fiber.
Yes.
But it may hit a copper network as well, and then make its way back to the switch.
Okay, so I think that's a common misunderstanding or misinterpretation, right? A lot of wireless advocates will say we don't need a lot of fiber. I mean, let's just do everything on wireless. You can cover lots of area, put up one tower, it's cheaper.
Yeah.
But common misperception is that, especially with advanced data speeds like 4G, you have to have fiber to a cell site.
Fiber is
location.
the best medium to get the speeds and the network that you need.
So those technologies really are symbiotic, right? They help each other, and frankly, they don't. It's more than help. They don't work without each other. You need the cell site piece and the handset piece for mobility. We love to be able to pack our devices around and have a data session, but we can't have that data session without a wireless connection or a fiber connection connecting that cell site to a core or a switch.
We used to have just a simple 1.5 megabyte connection. We call it a T1 to the cell site, and that handled hundreds of calls. Now we're getting almost a gig connections to each site in order to handle the traffic that's being generated through them.
1,000 megabits per second. So, okay, great. That helps me. One thing you two didn't mention is spectrum. So spectrum is a word that a lot of consumers have heard, but what does it really mean in this context? It took me several months and years to kind of get familiar with how critical spectrum is in a wireless network.
Well, it's
First of all, what is it?
well, it's the air interface, and it's in a frequency. So we may own a low band frequency, which would be in the megahertz range. We may own a mid band spectrum, and we may own high band spectrums, which get into the gigahertz wave there. So it's kind of like owning land. If you're a farmer and you own 10 acres, there's only so much you can do on 10 acres versus somebody that owns several thousand acres. If you don't have the land, of course, you can't build your house. And so if you want to add more things to that land, then you've got to own it. And so Strata's done a good job at looking at the spectral resources that are around and making sure that we have what we need.
And so who does Strata buy the spectrum from?
Well, generally an FCC auction, but there may be a big carrier that we own spectrum in a place that they want to own spectrum, and they may swap it with us.
Yeah, so the FCC, obviously federal entity, Federal Communications Commissions, they're the entity that oversees the distribution right, of all of these different spectrum blocks and licenses, making sure that carriers like Strata can participate in a competitive bidding process to actually win those and use those. And then once you own them, like you said, you may be able to trade them or swap them around or whatever with other carriers that own different rights or sell them.
We may be able to lease them or there's lots of different ways to get
spectrum.
So
just generally, once again, how many different spectrum blocks or licenses does Strata kind of have access to without, getting into anything too proprietary?
Oh, there's probably 10, 5 to 10 that would really matter at this point.
Okay.
That we really look at.
So in terms of real estate, using your analogy, Strata's well positioned for the future, for growth, for needing that, utilizing that spectrum to accommodate growing bandwidth and speeds.
Yeah, like I said, in my department, we're already looking out, a year and a half, 2 years out to see what the next technology is going to try to bring us.
Okay. Transition again here. So the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, recently, I think in the last year, a little over a year, banned Chinese equipment in U.S. wireless networks, correct?
Yep.
That ban was due to privacy concerns, real or perceived, probably a little bit of both.
Yep.
Where does Strata sit on that situation? Has Strata had a history of using Chinese equipment in their network?
No, we don't have any of that equipment in our network. We have worked through with some carriers. Some of the tier 1 carriers have actually had to certify that we don't have that in our network in order to remain roaming partners with them. So we've gone through certifications, and we don't have that. We don't have that in our network. Although
there are some rural wireless carriers that do have that issue, right? And now they're worrying about how to rip and replace, and it's a tough issue. Yeah, that equipment is very, very expensive too, right?
Yeah, fortunately, when we were doing our homework way back several years ago, that we made the right decision at that point. Great.
High level, what have been some of the challenges of being in the wireless business, Alan, from your perspective? I mean, as a regional or localized carrier, what are some of the challenges?
I think handsets have been a problem. Getting access to the latest and greatest that's coming out, it's always been a problem.
Is that still a problem today, you think, or is that for the time being resolved?
I think we've got most of it remedied. I mean, Jeff knows more about that in his group, but we can get those phones, and we've got them.
Yeah, there was a time, whether it was BlackBerry or Apple, RIM devices, there was a time when a lot of these large OEM, the manufacturers of these devices, they didn't really want to work with smaller carriers because just the economies of scale were.
Well, and they're still that way. I think handsets is one of the biggest issues that we have, just due to the fact that Strata is not going to go out and buy. We'd love to if we had the customer base to, but we don't go out and buy or commit to 1 million handsets or 10 million handsets. And the Samsungs and the Motorola's and the all the OEMs out there, and all of them are going to build custom software to people that can do that. And so we have to work with buying groups, smaller carriers like ourselves, get together and try to form a buying group that has enough volume to be able to get our hands on those things.
In today's climate, I think we've mostly remedied that situation. Although, like you said, it could become a challenge in the future sure.
We've had some OEMs, the handset manufacturers, work very well with us, and we appreciate that, and would call out them. But
so, has Spectrum always been readily available and affordable? Has that been another challenge?
Spectrum is a challenge, especially when it gets on a national basis, because again, we're not going to go buy a whole state's worth of Spectrum when we only need 3 counties. Mm-hmm. Some of the auctions are big enough that they only want to auction off chunks that big, and so we have to lobby and work hard to get the FCC to recognize that we don't want to buy, or we can't buy, Spectrum in those big chunks like the big carriers can. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and once again, I think obviously Strata's been able to navigate those pretty difficult waters, and due to some good managerial foresight, and then a lot of work with associations and lobbying groups, like you said. For now, things are okay, but that's another big challenge. Right. Spectrum is very, very expensive. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars worth of Spectrum, right?
Well, sometimes the last several auctions have been in the billions.
Yeah,
40 billion,
considering all the licenses that were issued, right?
Yep.
So this is a big deal.
Yeah.
The Spectrum purchases are a big deal. All right. So Strata states to their customers that we have a nationwide network. Yet you guys are telling me we only have 100, not only, but we have 100 cell sites. How do you make that happen? Where I think we've talked about it a little bit, but make sure we connect those two dots for the listeners.
we have that's where the roaming department comes in. We have to go out and negotiate with the carriers that we want to partner with, and allow them to roam on our network, and we host them as well as them hosting us. And so when we go out of the area where we don't have cell sites, we're able to continue that experience for the customer.
Okay. So yeah, it's pretty important that anybody that's not using Strata's wireless service understands that Strata actually does have a nationwide plan. Right. Strata doesn't charge roaming per se, any different than a Verizon or a T-Mobile or an AT&T would charge roaming on anybody else that's outside of their network. And so, those roaming agreements are really important for us to allow our customers to use their phone seamlessly when they travel to New York or California or Florida or Alaska or wherever, right?
Yeah. And in the roaming world, we're not really competitors. Mm-hmm. The roaming department is more of a partnering department. Mm-hmm. And so we have very good relationships with all of those, a lot of carriers.
Yeah. Gotcha. All right. I know Strata states that they have twice as many sites in the Uinta Basin as their competitors. Is that true?
Probably. I haven't said that in quite a while, but yeah, we've got a lot of towers in places where nobody else does.
Well, why would Strata do that? Doesn't that represent twice the cost?
Well, remember the old saying that coverage is king? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of areas where, and I understand that people want to get away sometimes from the phone, and that's fine, but there are a lot of other situations where you may need to check in or emergency help or something like that, and it's nice to be able to call and talk to somebody.
Well, I think Strata as a local organization, I think we're naturally a little bit more connected to our communities, and we understand to a certain degree more of those, those nuances of where coverage is really critical.
Right.
One of the elements of Spectrum and holding the Spectrum is that you have requirements typically to cover a certain amount of populations under the license, right? Yep. And if you don't do that, then you actually have to give the Spectrum license back to the FCC, correct? And what we see naturally is a lot of carriers will come in and they'll just pop up a cell site or two in the most populated areas to meet that requirement. And then they'll start selling services, right? And because that's the most economical, it makes sense, right? Yeah. Strata definitely, in being in the business for 20 plus years now, has built out a more robust network in the Uinta Basin for a few reasons, to really facilitate and connect our local consumers. We know where they need more coverage. Industry is more critical. I think we understand the oil and gas extraction businesses and where they need to work. And so that's why, right? I mean, and it does cost more to provide that network, and I think it's something we're proud of. should represent value to our customers, right?
I mean, if you live in the basin or are familiar with it, you understand the geography of it and, mountainous regions. And so it takes a lot of cell sites to cover those areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, it takes a lot of work to make over 100 cell sites sing like the choir too. I mean, it's we always relate it to like singing. If the network's out of tune, then the singing sounds terrible, right? So
somebody's off pitch.
Yeah. So are there differences or similarities between Strata's network here locally and a network in Salt Lake, for instance? Are they similar? The same technologies, same equipment, similar equipment? I mean,
well,
better, worse? Just kind of break it down.
With 4G, that's kind of the reconvergence of technology. And so for a long time, back in the analog days, we had analog, and that was really the only thing out there. And then they came up with a technology called TDMA and then CDMA. And we kind of started in the TDMA world, but decided CDMA was where we wanted to be because of some securities and it was better technology and things. TDMA kind of developed into the GSM technology world. And so that's kind of where carriers started to diverge is there became GSM carriers, and then there became CDMA carriers. And now with 4G, we've started to combine back. So as the GSM world goes away and the CDMA world goes away, where right now primarily voice is, you will see that the big carriers like AT&T, for instance, is a GSM carrier. So is T-Mobile. Those aren't compatible with Strata's CDMA network, but they are certainly compatible with Strata's LTE network. Mm-hmm. And so that technology is starting to come back and give us many, many more options now than we had before.
Kind of converging the technologies where they separated before.
Yep. It's exciting.
So an AT&T network here in the basin historically was not compatible with Strata's network at all. No. Like we couldn't roam on each other. Right. As we start to converge back to LTE and 5G, they will converge. I've used that word too many times, but where we can actually potentially use each other's network in situations where we don't have coverage or AT&T doesn't have coverage, right?
Right.
Okay. All right, 5G. I think we should start with the coronavirus question about 5G. I really want to see if I can make you two really uncomfortable. There's been all sorts of talks. There's crazy stuff happening with 5G and coronavirus. Like I was reading again today, I think yesterday in Salt Lake City, an individual chained himself to the base of a 5G site that's getting built and demanded that they cease construction on that location because of perceived health risks and issues. In the UK, they're burning, they've had 10, 20 different site locations that are getting burnt and vandalized, and because people believe that 5G is creating health risks and issues. What say you two? I want you two to weigh in on this highly contested discussion.
Well, first of all, I'll say I looked up some of the articles that you referenced, and the first line on one of those articles was a quote from Mark Twain. And it said, "A lie can travel around the world and back again while the truth is lacing up its boots."
Mm-hmm. It's probably true, yeah.
So, it's non-ionizing radiation, All of us were kids when the microwaves came out back in the day. And, what did your parents or grandparents tell you about the microwave? You put your food in, you push the button, and don't stand there and look at it. Don't put your face up to the glass. So non-ionizing.
That's the first thing you did when you were a kid, right? Well, just because they told you not to.
But we've had them around for years and years, and, it's non-ionizing. So it's the perception that it's negative to your health has been disproven, If you're smart about it, you're not going to climb up a tower and stand in front of a dish or something like that because you might get burned.
Mm-hmm. Well, the frequencies that 5G is using have been in use for several years. Yeah. Some of the 5G technologies the spectrum that they're talking about using has been used by the 4G network already. So they've already been exposed to it. Mm-hmm. If you stick food in a microwave that has a virus in it, the microwave kills the virus, right?
So maybe we're safer if we're standing in the 5G
So I don't think coronavirus was caused by 5G. Look at South Korea, for instance. They're the biggest promoter, the largest network of 5G, and yet they had the fastest downturn of coronavirus, right? So.
So maybe it is killing the virus.
Maybe
over
it
there.
is. Maybe I'm going to go stand by a 5G tower for the next few days and get.
So we're safe. We don't need to believe that. Then you're saying, huh? Okay.
No.
All right. So let's just simply stated, what's the big deal with 5G? Faster speeds?
Well, like we talked about, it's the 5th generation, and those spectrums have been used before. But basically, it's enhancing your coverage using your spectrum efficiently. Kind of like if you compare it to a transmission in a vehicle, say a standard 6-speed transmission. I like to simplify things and look at it that way. Your low band is going to be your first gear. Mm-hmm. You're not going to get there very fast, but you can go anywhere all day long in that. Your high band's going to be 6th gear. You can move really fast, but when it comes to a hill, you're going to have to grab a gear. Mm-hmm. Your 3rd and 4th in between is your medium. So
5G is currently being deployed on which bands?
5G is being deployed on low bands, so lower spectrum, 600 megahertz, 700 megahertz.
Okay.
Mid-band spectrum, so 2.5 megahertz, probably some in the 1.9, some coming up in the 3.65, the CBRS spectrums, and then the millimeter waves spectrums, the 24 gig, the 28 gig, those really high band spectrums. So it's kind of all over the place.
So I'm going to try to summarize and simplify and correlate for the listener, right? So there's different benefits to each one of those different deployment types, right? Yep. So a high band millimeter would be probably much faster speed in terms of a data speed on your phone, but you've got to be much closer to the cell site or the actual, transmission location, correct? Like
right.
What we're reading in the studies is that the signal in some of those situations may only travel a half a mile or a couple thousand feet.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yeah. The millimeter wave is not known for building penetration or refraction. It's just, it doesn't go very far, but it's like having 10 hoses watering your garden. Mm-hmm. There's much, much more spectrum. The blocks are bigger, so you can get more volume out of it.
In that deployment type, we've seen and read many studies that are saying consumers may be able to expect speeds as fast as 1 to 2 gigabits per second, right? Like that's blazing really fast. But I think we got to break that down and make sure people understand what that means. That means literally like a small cell site on every street corner.
Yep.
Right.
So in millimeter waves.
Yeah. So in a situation like New York City, I've also read this. I've read that if New York City were to deploy small cell millimeter wave 5G technology, which they're probably starting to do, some carriers, they would have more cell sites in New York City than all of the country combined previously.
Right.
Is that a fair statement?
Yeah.
Because they literally would have to place these like every 1,000 feet, right?
Yeah.
To get the proper coverage. And we need to remind the listener that every one of those would have to be connected with fiber. So people that say that 5G will just replace fiber, it won't. It'll actually perpetuate fiber. It actually requires fiber to function correctly, right?
Yeah, and a lot of the deployment strategies for those carriers is not to right now blanket the whole city of New York or Salt Lake or somewhere. They're deploying the 5G where there's big volumes of traffic. So in a stadium right? Or somewhere like that where where they have low or high densities of people but small areas, they're kind of using that as a hot spot.
So what's the more common 5G deployment that we're hearing about now, as we're starting to hear that there's just a few handsets that are claiming to be 5G capable? They are 5G capable, and some carriers are starting to talk about 5G, although they're putting a little E on the end of it, whatever that means. Maybe you guys can interpret for us. What's that deployment look like? What are the typical speeds? How does it compare to like the 4G LTE that Strata's already deployed and has had deployed since 2011?
Well, the speeds are more related to the spectrum than I guess the technology, and so 4G's pretty fast, and we can aggregate several different spectrums of 4G to get speeds higher. The same technology exists in 5G. You aggregate spectrum to get things higher, and so if one garden hose doesn't put enough water out, you put two together and use the combined volume of both to get that. But there's, depending on which carrier you look at, some are deploying 5G in low band. Some are up in the millimeter wave, and some are in the mid bands. And so there's no real strategy that I guess any one carrier is using. Some are deploying it, I think, in the low band more for the icon on the phone than they are for the speeds. And so just having a 5G RF wave out there will light the little light on your phone and say 5G, but the speed and the throughput of that is not much different than what you're already getting through 4G.
So you're saying it's a bunch of marketing hype?
Yeah, some of it.
Well, some of it is definitely marketing hype, right? Everybody's rushing to be the first one there to claim it, right? Like
right.
Biggest 5G network, first 5G network, fastest 5G network. It's all about winning the consumer's dollar. And so sometimes maybe the message gets ahead of the technology, and I think that's probably true in this situation, correct?
Yeah, I heard about, it's probably maybe been a year ago now, that the only app that was out there that was truly developed for 5G was Speed Test, just to make everybody feel good that they got a fast speed test. Now, I think in the last year, technology's made leaps and bounds in the 5G world. If you go to the CES Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas last year, they had lots and lots of 5G technology, and I think it's really exciting over 4G because I think it's more of a cloud technology. And so if a firefighter, for instance, is wearing gear that is 5G enabled, then as they leave the station and roll up onto a fire, as an example, there's probably hundreds of other examples we could use, but this is just one that I had heard and read about. But as they roll up onto a fire, their vitals are being streamed back to a somebody watching that. They can tell whether they're anxious, or they can tell if their heart rate's really elevated, or when they're actively in the fire, they can tell whether something's wrong with them and their breathing and things like that. And so 5G really enables the edge of the cloud so that everything becomes part of a network, not just reporting to a network. So 5G being low latency and all that. I don't know if you've ever tried to look at doing 5G with a little something as simple as moving a ball around what do they call it?
Just a platter,
a labyrinth or something like that, trying to negotiate the ball. They did this at a show where they did that in 5G and then 4G. And in a 4G world, the latency was just enough that you couldn't move that ball where it needed to. It always fell through the wrong hole. And when they enabled 5G, then the speeds and the reactions were fast enough that they could negotiate that ball to the end.
So latency is a term that we use a lot in the industry, but some people probably don't understand exactly what that means. It's just responsiveness, correct?
Right.
Low latency is very high response. It responds very quickly, right?
It's what gamers want.
Yes.
Gamers
they don't want
really
any
want
delay
that.
at all in the signal being sent and received. And so low latency in our terminology basically means that on a 5G network, it's very, very responsive, very, very little delay.
Right.
So that ball can roll around on that labyrinth, and it can adjust very quickly and guide it to where it wants to go.
In the 1 to 2 millisecond range versus 30 to 40.
Yeah. Okay. So when is 5G coming to the basin? That's the thing that everybody wants to know. I want to know that.
I'm going to defer that to Jeff. He'll probably defer it to him.
Yeah, like I said before, my team has been watching 5G for over a year now, and all the equipment that we've deployed has been with the thought of 5G in our minds. And so the sites that we've recently put in, the backhaul that feeds the sites that we've put in is all 5G prepped, and pretty much with the throw of a switch to a software upgrade to our network, we could be in the 5G realm. Now we work with a partner named Rena who does the switching fabric of the network, and RENA has already put in play for the core to be a 5G core as well. So we're right on the edge of that. I don't know specific dates on when I would say we'd turn that on, but it's
really
ready.
quickly. We promised earlier in the show, and you've mentioned it twice now, that we would break down RENA. Just really quickly. So RENA, give us a 30-second explanation of what RENA is. What is that, an acronym?
Yeah, Rural Independent Network Alliance. So,
okay, Rural Independent Network Alliance. Okay.
So the RENA core is primarily owned by STRATA, or the majority owner of it. They work with lots of carriers around the country, carriers that cannot afford to have their own core infrastructure, but would like to have a wireless play. One may be Nuclear Natarita over in Colorado, where they only deployed maybe 15 sites, but there's not enough revenue off of 15 sites to own your own core, but they can through the RENA network, because we can all, kind of like the handsets, we've got together with a buying group, and we can make that core available to carriers that otherwise couldn't afford it.
Gotcha. So it's basically like a cost sharing mechanism,
Yep.
right? Where Strata owns this asset, and they're saying, well, we have excess capacity on this asset, and we can go out and work with these smaller carriers that want to buy a slice of the pie, and we can share it with them.
Yep.
They benefit, we benefit.
Yeah.
And then you share resources and expertise. So that's what RENA is, huh?
We just enlarged our family.
That's right. That's exactly right. So how many other owners are there within RENA? We talking like dozens, 20, 30, or a handful?
No, there's a handful of owners. There's several. Well, there's two different types of ownership. I won't get into that, but there's a type A and a type B. So everybody's an owner under the B platform, but there's some capital owners that own more stocks into RENA.
Gotcha.
That. But we touch around 30 carriers nationwide.
Oh, awesome.
With pieces and parts of our network.
And that's all happening right here in the Uinta Basin?
Yep.
So, and it's a majority owned majority owned subsidiary, not wholly owned, but majority owned subsidiary of STRATA Networks, right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So there's employees of STRATA that are assigned
to RENA
to RENA as their primary function.
Right.
Kind of interesting. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, we'll probably do another podcast in the future specifically about RENA, because it's one of those things that's happening right here in the Uinta Basin. Highly technical.
Yep.
Really
cool.
a cool thing, but most people don't know anything about it.
Right.
So, all right. Well, we're probably getting close to wrapping this up, fellas. We've taken quite a bit of time. Do you guys have some kind of closing thoughts or anything that we haven't touched that you guys want to hit on? Don't fight over the mic, you two.
We both looked at each other like, you want to talk first?
Go ahead, Benny. Anything you want to mention?
Oh, it's a great network. It's a great job and career to be in, and the people make it better. But it's fun to be in, fast paced, and look into the future to see what's going to come out next, and challenges like that, and making sure we have coverage for anybody that needs it. I mean, look at the agriculture and medical issues that the 5G and the faster speeds are going to benefit. It's going to be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeff?
Yeah, I think 5G is going to be an awesome technology once everything's developed for it. It's going to make our hospitals, our doctors, our infrastructure, just everything's going to be so much cooler in that. I guess with we always knew how important communications have been, but I think the whole COVID-19 thing has kind of brought that more to light, maybe. And I've seen the traffic that's generated on the network, and people staying home and using the traffic, and how important that is to the communication around the basin. I think Strata's always tried to stay up with that, stay forefront with it. The wireless department to me is a cool place to be, because we're always kind of watching cutting edge. So if we do something, I tell my group, if you got bored today, you didn't do your job, because we expect them to be looking for stuff, and it may be something that never pans out, but it may be something that's really important to us, and we're always trying to push ahead to that. And it's a cool place to be. It's fun to be on the edge of the bed, wondering what's going to keep you from going off.
That's right. That's right. It is. It's very fast paced, very challenging.
Yep.
very rewarding also. It's nice to know that we are working to provide a service that consumers absolutely have to have and need, not only for entertainment and convenience, but for, critical life-saving functions like emergency response and all those things, industry like we've talked about. So it is a great industry to be in, and it's rewarding and challenging and satisfying all at the same time.
Well, imagine without the 5G coming, if you're a rural community like we are, and, the doctors are all out on the Wasatch Front, the specialists, that may help. We got great doctors here, but being able to phone in and have one of them, even at our local hospital, have one of them call in and with the ambulance and do that. If you didn't have no delay in the network, that would be really, really hard. And then when they're doing surgery, if they needed to call in a specialist, out somewhere else, anywhere in the country, really, anywhere in the world, they could get in and help with remote surgeries.
Yeah.
So I think it's
with low latency, absolutely. Well, it's been a great conversation. I appreciate it. Hopefully, we've kind of peeled back the layers of let people look into what it's really like to own and operate and manage a wireless network, the challenges and the satisfaction, and hopefully listeners have a bit of a better understanding of some of those challenges and the difficulties. 5G's coming. We're working fast and hard at getting it here for our consumers, right? And it is going to be a fantastic technology and service once deployed. Yep. And we'll keep working to get once those handsets are available and more broadly commercially available, we'll get those and get them distributed. So
our 4G network's pretty darn fast.
Oh yeah, that is absolutely it is.
So don't wait till 5G.
That's right.
Use it now.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, we want to thank the listeners for listening, and always want to encourage them to drop a question or a comment and give us feedback on future conversation topics that might be of interest to them. You can email us at podcast@stratanetworks.com or drop a question or a comment in the social feed where we'll post this. And once again, really appreciate you two taking the time to come into the studio and share your knowledge and your experience. Appreciate it.
Been fun.
Thanks again for listening to the Strata Networks podcast.